I am Dr. Rajeshwari, working as Associate Professor in the Department of Demography at Indian Institute of Health and Family Welfare, Hyderabad. Today I am going to discuss with you about differential fertility. This module is concerned with differential fertility in India. In this module we discuss mainly about what is differential fertility, what is the use of studying differential fertility, factors influencing differential fertility, like educational attainment and fertility, economic status and fertility, occupation of the husband and fertility, employment of wife and fertility, religion, caste, race and fertility. What is the differential fertility? The variation in fertility of different groups or classes in the population. The levels and patterns of fertility vary considerably in various subgroups of the same population. These subgroups may be based on residence, whether urban or rural, social and economic status in terms of educational attainment, occupation, size of land holding, religion, caste, race, etc. What is the use of studying differential fertility? It is useful in identifying the factors which determine fertility levels among various subgroups, and this also gives us some idea of the future proportion of each group in the total population, and it also helps us to project more accurately the future population size of the entire country. Coming to the educational attainment and fertility. Among the various socio-economic determinants of fertility, education, especially female education, has received considerable attention from scholars and researchers. The female education is an important factor even after controlling for related variables such as place of residence, rural or urban, income levels of households and education levels of husbands. Education for the most part operates indirectly through the various channels, namely through the supply of and demand for children as well as through the cause of regulation. Each of these channels is affected by several intervening determinants which are influenced by the extent of women's autonomy, often considered to be a product of education. Women's autonomy is seen as taking 5 forms: autonomy through knowledge, exposure of women to the modern world, decision-making autonomy, interaction with a wider social circle, emotional autonomy, and economic and social autonomy, self-reliance, control over economic resources. Abadian, in her study of 54 developing countries, finds that female autonomy operationalized through age-at marriage of women, differences in age between spouses, and rates of secondary schooling among women has a negative and significant impact on fertility. Abadian, in her study, also observes that education acts directly on fertility rates and works through infant mortality rates to decrease fertility. Education affects the supply of children through 4 intervening variables. These are age at marriage, breastfeeding, postpartum abstinence, and child mortality. Education tends to increase the age at first marriage, thereby decreasing the number of years that can be devoted to childbearing. This relationship between women's education and age at marriage has been found in almost all fertility studies. Cleland and Jijiboy show that in almost every country in South Asia, women with education get married roughly 2 to 5 years later than uneducated women. A study of 26 developing countries sponsored by the United Nations finds that age at marriage invariably increases with the level of education in all of the countries examined, despite the fact that age at marriage varies widely across countries. According to Jijiboy, age at marriage is affected by education through decision-making autonomy, interaction with a wider world, emotional autonomy and self-reliance. Besides delaying marriage, female education has been observed to be associated with greater numbers of women not marrying at all. Women with higher education levels are more likely to be able to organize their lives outside the realm of marriage and family. For example, in Thailand, only about 1.9% of women without education do not marry, whereas 14.6% of highly educated women do not marry. Then coming to breastfeeding. Prolonged breastfeeding is one of the traditional practices that serves as a means of contraception. With increases in the levels of education of women, the period of breastfeeding tends to decrease. Breastfeeding practices are affected by education through knowledge autonomy, decision-making autonomy, and emotional autonomy. Coming to postpartum abstinence, the kind of relationship that was observed in case of breastfeeding is also observed when one examines the relationships between postpartum abstinence and fertility. Women's compliance to the traditional norms that encourage prolonged postpartum abstinence tends to decline with increases in the levels of female education. Evidence with regard to South Asia is scarce and researchers have not been able to find any relationship between female education and postpartum abstinence. Cleland and Jijiboy argue that recent research findings suggest that the length of postpartum abstinence and education are unrelated. But in countries where education does have an effect, examples of sub-Saharan African societies, the effect of education is channeled through knowledge, autonomy, decision-making autonomy, and emotional autonomy. Then comes the child mortality. High rates of child mortality reduce the supply of children, which in turn is likely to increase the demand for children. The existence of a linear relationship between mother's education and child mortality has been well established. With a high rate of child survival, parents can be certain that they need not have many babies in order to maintain their desired family size. Moreover, with the death of an infant, duration of breastfeeding and postpartum abstinence is curtailed and promotes fertility. Thus, with the survival of children, intervals between births are likely to be widened. Female education affects child survival through all the 5 forms of female autonomy described by Jijiboy. Then how female education and demand for children is interrelated. Female education has an impact on the demand for children via these variables: desired family size, son preference, labor contributions of offspring during childhood, children as old age support, children as sources of prestige, and economic time and opportunity costs of raising children. Desired family size. With education, women became much less fatalistic regarding their family size. As Kokoch notes in a study of fertility in Nigeria, only 10% of women with education beyond the primary stage believed fertility to be determined by God, whereas 50% of the totally uneducated women held that belief. In most research studies, it has been found that desired family size becomes smaller with the increase in women's educational levels. However, the strength of relationship varies from culture to culture, depending mainly on the degree of gender stratification in the society under this study. Education has less impact in highly gender stratified societies than in relatively egalitarian societies. Education affects desired family size through all the 5 forms of autonomy that it brings about. Coming to son preference. In gender stratified societies as in South Asia, son preference is a common feature. If a couple desires to have 2 living sons, they will end up having 3.9 children on an average. If parents want at least 1 daughter and 1 son, the average would turn out to be 3. Thus, son preference increases the family size significantly in the long run. Chaudhary finds that in Bangladesh, son preference is so strong that even education above primary level cannot counteract it. Cleland and Jijiboy suggest that very high levels of education are required in order to counter the preference for son in such societies. The higher education of women through providing them self-reliance, social and economic autonomy probably has a negative impact on son preference. The labor contribution of offspring during childhood. Better educated women are more likely to educate their children and to send them to school. Their expectations with regard to their children's labor are not as great as those of uneducated women who believe that a function of children is to help their parents in economic activities. Jijiboy cites evidence from a study carried out in Maharashtra in India. the study reveals that expected and actual levels of support from sons diminished as women's educational levels increased. For girls, the decline is relatively modest as more emphasis is placed on sons' schooling. Overall, the children of women with secondary education only contribute about 60% of the labor that is contributed by the children of uneducated women. Cleland and Jijubai also mention several other similar studies. Effects of female education on child labor are channeled through self-reliance and social and economic autonomy. Children as old age support. One of the perceived benefits of children is as providing a means of support in old age. With increasing levels of education, women tend to rely less on their children for support in old age and economic help and housing. However, the effect of education varies with the intensity of gender stratification in the society. In highly gender stratified societies, a higher level of education is required in order to have a significant impact. As the level of education of women increases, they are more likely to depend on other types of resources such as personal savings rather than relying solely on their children, especially their sons. Women's education affects the extent to which children are perceived as sources of support in old age through social and economic autonomy and self-reliance. Economic, time and opportunity costs of children. Education leads to aspirations for better qualified children with higher standards of childcare other than feeding, housing and clothing children. Educated parents perceive costs to be higher because they have to arrange for a better education for their children. Level of education of children tends to have a direct relationship with mother's schooling. Thus, raising equally children is perceived by the parents to be costly, hence reducing the number of desired children and fertility. More highly educated women are more likely to be engaged in paid employment outside the home. An educated woman is likely to take into account the loss of income that will result from having more children and may therefore decide not to have large numbers of children. Besides this opportunity cost, better educated women also feel it necessary to spend more time with children and are less likely to leave young children in the care of older siblings. This time cost leads educated women to have fewer children than uneducated women. Education affects the perceptions of mothers in terms of economic opportunity and time costs of children through knowledge autonomy, decision-making autonomy and self-reliance. Children as means of enhancing prestige. In some societies in Asia and Africa, a woman's sense of identity, legitimation, recognition, security and prestige in the family is dependent on her having children. Although very few studies have been carried out in this area, the evidence suggests that the education of women serves as an alternative means of gaining respect. As an educated person, an educated woman is considered to be knowledgeable. If she earns money by working in an honorable occupation, she is likely to be highly valued. Education brings in prestige for a woman in spite of not having many children through social and economic autonomy and self-reliance. Female education and the cause of regulation, that is contraceptive use. Studies have overwhelmingly documented positive and significant relationships between female education and contraceptive use. Female education affects the use of contraception through the acquisition of knowledge regarding contraception and through increased spousal communication. Knowledge about contraception. There appears to be a positive relationship between education of women and contraceptive knowledge. Cleland and Jijubai argue that the role of schooling becomes more apparent in terms of detailed knowledge, the number of methods, especially non-terminal methods, known the correct use of a particular method, and from where a particular method can be acquired. For example, they refer to a study showing that in India, 95% of women with secondary education knew about IUD, whereas only 39% of the uneducated women had the knowledge of this method of birth control. In many developing countries, it has been observed that even women who are highly educated do not have an adequate understanding of reproductive physiology upon which the success rate of traditional and modern contraceptive methods depend. Moreover, there still exists a large gap between knowledge and the actual practice of contraception. Communications between spouses. The education of women, even primary level education, also breaks another barrier to contraception: lack of spousal intimacy, which restricts free discussion on sexual matter or on issue related to contraception. Education affects spousal communication through emotional autonomy and decision-making autonomy. The number of unwanted pregnancies is lower among educated women than among uneducated women. Educated women are more likely to use contraception consistently as soon as if the desired family size has been completed. The gap between desired family size and actual family size shows the unmet need for contraception among uneducated women. Thus, female education, in addition to having many other benefits, also goes a long way in reducing fertility. But what level of education threshold is required for it to have a negative impact on fertility? In the next section, I reflect on this issue. Economic status and fertility. General studies in the past have highlighted the inverse relationship between the economic status of the family and fertility. This traditional relationship is now undergoing substantial changes as far as the developed countries are concerned. In India, very few studies have gone into this question of the relationship between the income of the family and fertility. In 3 rounds of the National Sample Surveys 1959-60, 60-61 and 61-62, the Fertility and Family Planning Study conducted in Greater Bombay in 1966, and in the studies of fertility differentials in India conducted by the Registrar General, the traditional inverse relationship between economic status and fertility has been observed. The analysis of data proved both rural India and in urban India on the basis of per capita monthly household expenditure in rupees and the total marital fertility rate and standardized marital fertility rates for rural and urban India indicated that as per capita income monthly expenditure increases, the fertility rate goes down. Thus, an indirect relationship between income and fertility has been confirmed. Then, occupation of the husband and fertility. In developed countries, occupation, especially that of the husband, is used indicator of social economic status, and differential fertility is according to the occupation of the husband. Studies conducted in Europe around 1970 indicated that the wives of farmers and farm workers recorded a higher fertility than the wives of men engaged in non-agricultural occupations. Even amongst those engaged agriculture, the fertility of the group of farm workers was higher than that of the group of farmers. These differences were more pronounced in France and United States than in other countries. Manual workers were also found to have on an average more children than non-manual workers. In the non-manual class, the differences between the higher and the lower grades either not exist or were negligible. In India, some studies have tried to investigate the relation between the occupation of the husband and fertility. It was generally observed that the wives of those engaged in professional jobs had the lowest fertility. Agarwal found that cultivators and laborers had on an average 7.4 children, and those who reported their occupations as service and those who were professionals had an average 6.6 children. Drivers' findings indicate that the wives of unskilled workers, agriculturists and artisans had higher fertility than the wives of clerks. Employment of wife and fertility. It has been evident from several studies that the gainfully employed women have a smaller number of children than those who are not employed. Though this relationship has been quite distinct in many industrialized countries, the exact nature of this relationship is not yet known. Is it the women who have smaller number of children tend to take paid work outside their homes, or is it that those who have already in paid work may restrict their family size to the very minimum so they can work outside home? It is difficult to say anything very firmly. Religion and fertility. Various studies in the West, which is essentially dominated by the Christian, Hebraic tradition show that the fertility of Catholics has exceeded that of non-Catholics in almost every country and socio-economic group. The studies conducted in the United States and Canada have clearly pointed out that fertility of Roman Catholics has been higher than that of their Protestants of Jews. Recent findings, however, indicate that in most of the European countries as well as in Canada, differentials in fertility by religious affiliations are narrowing. In the United States, or on the other hand, the gap is widening. The reason for this narrowing of differences may be due to modifications in the religious sanctions relating to the ideology and practice of birth control and the weakening of the influence of religious doctrines and traditions. It may also be that the influence of other socio-economic factors such as urban residence, educational attainment, etc. on fertility is on the wane, with the result that fertility differentials are narrowing. India may be taken as an illustration from the developing countries. In most of the studies conducted in India to study the fertility behavior of various religious groups, it was observed that the Muslims had a higher fertility rate than the Hindus or the Christians. An analysis of census data from 1881 to 1971 indicates that the Muslims have invariably had higher growth rates for each decade, and these have been attributed to the higher fertility. In pre-partition India, the fertility of Muslims was about 15% higher than that of Hindus. Recent rounds of national sample survey and other small-scale surveys have confirmed this finding. The fertility and family planning study conducted in Greater Bombay in 1966 also found that marital fertility of Muslim women was significantly higher than that of Hindu women. No differences were observed between the fertility of Hindu and Christian women. The fertility of Parsis women was the higher level. As caste and fertility. As caste is an important indicator of social status in India, attempts have been made in several studies to observe fertility differentials by caste. In a study conducted in Lucknow city, it was observed that upper caste Hindus had on an average 3 live births, while the lower caste Hindus had on an average 4.1 births. In multiracial societies, differences in fertility have been found among various racial groups. In the United States, for example, the Negroes show a higher fertility than the white community. The differences, however, have been explained away by socio-economic factors. Conclusion. When fertility differentials are studied in relation to various socio-economic and cultural factors, it is found that in many developed countries, they are narrowing, and latest trend is towards uniformity. In developing countries like India, fertility differentials have in recent times become increasingly pronounced. Amos Hale has identified three phases in trends in fertility differentials. First phase, various socio-economic classes either had identical fertility rate or the relationship seems to be positive. In the second phase, which began with the industrialization and the resulting socio-economic development, it was the highly educated urban elite group which showed declines in fertility, thus showing a wave of fertility differentials. In the final phase, which is in existence now in many Western countries, there appears to be a positive association between socio-economic status and fertility.